Darren Snyder,
Right.
introduced us here. And so he said, I hope he said that you were on the cover of Thrasher magazine.
Yeah, 1980. Yeah, 1984. Tom Groholski's ramp, North Brunswick, New Jersey. Glenn Friedman, who from My Rules and the quintessential Dogtown photographer. He was a photographer that day, and there's another typical situation of like us being Cherry Hill locals, myself and Tom. Cherry Hill closing down. Tom having a ramp in his backyard. He had a blue fiberglass ramp that was about like waist high and really easy to ride. So we were able to keep our skateboarding chops up through things kind of dying down because all the parks died down. And then his father started scouring, looking at skate parks for sale and skate ramps. And he found like a 10-foot high plexiglass clear ramp that was in Staten Island, New York. And he drove up with a flatbed truck. And I remember Tom going, yeah, my dad just bought a vert ramp. And they set it up, added flat bottom to it, put coping on one side, angle iron on the other. And we turned that little backyard scene in North Brunswick into Tom getting a front cover of Thrasher magazine, and then me getting the front cover of Thrasher magazine, which I wasn't even supposed to get it. Like Glenn was just coming to photography just to shoot Tom and I. There was no set thing like, Chuck, you should do your layback rollout and practice it. Like he just saw me do it. It was like, we're going to have to do about like 20 or 30 of those. And I'm like, what? He's like, so he's do it again. This ramp is 12 foot wide and Tom added a foot of vert on it. It was like 12 foot wide, about like 11 foot high. So like,
wow.
It's like, there's no room, but that's what we had to skate. And Glenn, once again, was able to just keep the lifestyle of us inside. He didn't want to be like, let's go to a better ramp or a different ramp. He's like, no, he knew where to position himself on that ramp to get that angle. I mean, but literally you could throw like a rock from the platform into like the house window. I mean, it was like, literally if a skateboard would go off the side of the ramp, it would shoot in someone's backyard. And sometimes, maybe once or twice, once definitely, Jim Murphy skateboard flew off and just smashed Tom's dad's window, like completely out to his plumber's truck. I mean, it wouldn't be the ramp to have in your backyard today, what we had to do. And Glenn was able to take our little backyard scene and give us careers. Very, very, very good for us. Very good for East Coast skateboarding.
Oh, heck yeah. How did you learn that you were going to be on the cover?
I called Fausto to see, because there was a section where Tom and I were doing doubles, but I was kind of laying on the platform with my neck dangling in the ramp, and Tom was basically doing a 1-footed invert onto extension over me. So it was like his whole entire body and board was flying over my head. So I was more interested in that. What the doubles thing was, because they said it was going to be, that was the staple of what the photo shoot was all about.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? Like Glenn still had all the shots of me doing the layback, but I was more in my mind going for the doubles thing in the magazine. And then I got Fausto on the phone because I was like, let me just call Thrasher. And I was at my mom's house in Philly. And I was like, hey, just Fausto, what's going on? Fausto ran Independent and also Cohen on a Thrasher. He was like, you have the front cover of the magazine. And I was like, what? He's like, you got the last black and white front cover of the magazine.
Oh, wow.
Congratulations. And then hung up the phone. Fausto was like a straight ahead guy. You know what I mean? He would give you props for a second and then just move on. He wasn't like, he didn't like to fill people's egos with false hoods. You know what I mean? It was always about, this is what you're doing. It fits the format. For some reason, your photo just landed right when it was the last black and white issue. So we decided to make that. And then that magazine cover ended up getting me the Nike deal with the Nike sneaker and everything. So for some reason, Thrasher and Fausto and Kevin Thatcher, Mofo, Eric Swenson, whatever these guys were doing at the time, I don't know how they knew it was going to line up. Like, it's not that they knew that it was going to line up for the benefit of me. For some reason, they knew back then Thrasher was about 3 to 4 months ahead, how they were staggering that fanzine of a magazine. Like, they had issues already out. So I knew the thought process of what they were going through, of how heavy the magazine was, because we were just starting to interact with them on a just small basis of what the magazine was all about. So it's just amazing that a photographer can come to a backyard, take some photos. He has a name, he has a passion, but there's no backstory other than like, I'm just going to New Jersey to photo these guys. And then all of a sudden my career is turned around because of dedication to the love of the lifestyle and the sport. I mean, that's what I get from all of it. You know what I mean? It's not like I'm some great athlete or the best skater. It's, as I said before, I never wanted to do that for the reason of having love for skateboarding. And skateboarding just felt like music to me. It just felt like highly creative. And I always wanted to have that in my photos, you know, even if they were just basic photos.
So after that, so then you started picking up sponsors. You said Nike and Thunder Trucks at one point, it sounded like. And,
yeah.
Did you have a board sponsor?
Before the front cover in 1982, myself and Tom Grolski, we decided, like, why don't we just write some companies and see what happens. So I wrote his letter as he was saying it to me, and he wrote my letter. And then we both submitted letters to Madrid Skateboards, Gullwing Trucks, OJ Wheels, and Vans. And we were tripping on Vans a bit because at that time, Vans had filed Chapter 11. And we thought Chapter 11 meant the end of your, we thought bankruptcy at that time, so stupid. It was the end of your business. We didn't know that.
No, I get that, yeah.
Able to save you from having people come in, basically put a lien on your proverbial company that you sank all this money into, but you realize you're not getting your actual returns back. So you have to kind of have some kind of like floodgate there to keep all that water pressure from coming into the company. So with them being following Chapter 11, we were able to just kind of be a part of this company, but also know that we were very privileged because skateboarding was rebuilding itself. So we were part of this whole Chapter 11 revised version of what Vans was supposed to be. And within a year of us being sponsored by Vans and Gullwing, Madrid, and OJ Wheels, Vans just decided to do a tour, like take out the old school plexi ramp that had no flat bottom on a flatbed truck, and you set it up, and we just went and did demos at malls. And so before I even got the front cover of the magazine, Tom and I were integrated in, you know, that world, you know what I mean? Just
that's awesome.
Skating around and making it work. So about time that I got the front cover, you know, Vans had already, because the sneakers that I'm wearing on that front cover are Vans, but there were some Vans that had only been released at that time. You know, they were like, they looked more like Chuck Taylors. So it was hard for me to even remember what kind of sneakers I was wearing. I was like, wow, that's when Vans was starting to shift out of just the regular old school Vans, you know what I mean, into what they would integrate, them starting to be more of a skate sneaker. You know what I mean? Something that was more like I don't want to say a well-rounded tennis shoe, but a tennis shoe that could be worn by all different types of skaters, because it was just a dock sneaker in the beginning. Right. And they're all modeled after that boat, yacht kind of vibe. So it's the sponsors were earlier on, but the identity of what Glenn gave us was to give our sponsors hope that the East Coast could have an actual scene and create doors for Mike Vallely or Chris Pastras or, you know, any other people that came after we had our first explosion. Dan Tagg, you know, Bernie O'Dowd, you know, just different folks. There's so many other people that are around. Darren Mendito, people we help bridge the gap for the darker years so they wouldn't have to go through it. You know what I mean? We were telling the companies, you got to sponsor this kid. They didn't have to, all they had to do is just do the sessions with us, and we were able to help people come into this awareness of like, yo, I can get sponsored too if I'm hanging with Chuck and Tom, because they're going to help build the scene.
Oh man, yeah, that's incredible sounding. Just, you know, and that's so cool. You know, to lift up the next group that's, you know, coming in, you know, use your notoriety to be able to, you know, lift up the up and comers. And I think that's,
it was a lonelier time, and we remember taking our first skate, say I was 18, when Tom and I first drove down to Jacksonville, Florida to skate Kona for their contest in '82. And from that point, we were encouraging people to just get out and drive. And there's no GPS. I mean, you had to learn how to read a map, a paper map, for one. And you had to learn how to ask questions from people who didn't speak your language, because the minute that you got down south, it sounded like people were speaking another language. You know what
That's
I mean?
true.
Yeah. You're a kid from up north. You don't know any better until you get down there and you pull off at the gas station, and you got to really go ask somebody, where's this skate park or this skate ramp? Or do you know anything about this? Or do you know anything about that? You know, and people 9 times out of 10 would be cool. We rarely ever ran into any problems. You know what I mean? Just searching for skateboarding, searching for that, like being able to find something and then taking that back home and saying, guys, go get this person, go talk to that person, go. It was really cool piecing the whole vibe. You know what I mean? Like, you know, just that whole early sense of skateboarding made a lot of sense, and music was connected with it, but it made super sense for us to be able to promote through Thrasher and through Trans World and through our endorsements and our sponsors to get these other kids in, to actually bring the scene into giving it back to California. Basically what sponsored skating did, it took all the gems from the East Coast and the weird spots and push them right out to the West Coast. And people are still doing it to this day. It's just that they have a clearer vision because of what we laid. We actually paved the road to say, hey, it's good to venture outside of your hometown and create some commerce with people. Especially nowadays, you have to. It's more punk rock now. It's more punk rock now than it was back when punk rock was unique. I think it's way harder now to start a band. It's way harder now to have anything really personable. You have to really troubleshoot to find out if people are really unique, because someone can look unique and not have the right amount of years that you may need as a person to be influenced. They may just look the part. And there's nothing wrong with that.
It's very easy to look the part.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
You know, it's the Zoomies mentality of not being Zoomies. You know what I mean? It's like, you can apply yourself to everything, but how are you going to find the real genuine people in so much to choose from? You know what I mean? It's like Halloween right now. Everything is Halloween.
Yeah, like everyone's playing dress up.
Yeah.
No, I totally get that. And so,
and I'm not against it. I'm all for it. I'm just glad that I know how to troubleshoot it. And for me, as accepting myself within skateboarding and music, the minute that I started thinking, this is just like punk rock with a cell phone and a computer, all of this stress started making sense. And how we're being treated now starts to make more sense, because we visually have more freedom to say no to things that don't gel with us. So that there has to be, I think, more things in place to implement pressure, because you're able to make quicker decisions on things you like and things you don't like. So the people that work at antagonizing fear and creating diversion or separation, they have to work just as hard as we do. You know, the old school ways don't scare people anymore. You know, it's like it's being without doesn't scare people anymore. You know what I mean? It's just, how long can you be without? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's the question for sure.
Yeah. So that's to me, it's the reason why I think all this stuff is making so much sense. It's like the questions are great, but if people would really go back into the research, it'd be like, just imagine if we had cell phones going like, this is the first fanzine. This is the first so-and-so. We're doing it now. This is the first sign of COVID. This is the first sign of like our president going so-and-so. And this is the first time that people are split about politics, but everyone wants to vote just so they can get their voice heard. So for some reason, everyone's punk rock now. Like everyone's suffering. Everyone's got a reason to be like, nah, I have to have a voice. I'm on something for a reason. I have a story to tell for a reason. It's the only reason why social media exists, because somebody has something to do for a reason, versus we had to create the reason and believe in the reason and focus the reason before we can even be accepted in our little microcosms, before we can even be accepted in your neighborhood bands, or before you can even be accepted to headline a show. You had to earn your keep. You know what I mean? You had to earn your keep. You didn't want to headline a show with a bunch of bands that you didn't like. You wanted to headline the show with bands that you did like, and you have to build rapport with people to like things and to know that, oh, I can't wait. Wow, Minor Threat, or Scream is putting us on our second or third show. I love Scream. Like, this is great. Like, remember JFA booked us twice. Like, oh my, like we had played so many shows before we even got a chance to play with JFA. Like the first time I saw JFA is as a fan, you know, and then getting to play shows with them and still knowing Brian to this day and Michael and all those guys. I still go back to those days of like, whoa, man, that's really heavy that those guys gave us a chance when they were already developed. Like they were already like in the midst of all that LA, California stuff that the East Coast kid is dreaming about. Like, why do they have so much freedom? Why is there punk rock? Why does it sound so crisp and vibrant? You know, they just had the opportunities that were darker to us. But if we would have had those same opportunities, there would have been no contrast. There would have been no reason for us to search, to travel. It would have been like, they're doing their thing, we're doing our thing. You know, like the hip hop thing, the West Coast beef that happened. It was just because it was more visual. It was more, people had more things to pick at. There was never been an East Coast, West Coast beef, I think, in punk rock ever.
No, yeah, I can't think of one really. No.
You know what I mean? There's never really been gangs and different factions of people having beef and, you know, so and so and so and so, and this person dissed that person, but that's just life. You know what I mean? That's just playing chess on a crooked board. You know what I mean? You know what's going to happen. You know what I mean? Like, I think that what we're doing is giving people a sense of the history of what's been created within punk rock is so vital that we need to really uncover most of everything about it. Even guys that are older than me, the guys that are still around that can talk, that maybe aren't so famous, but still have maybe a gem of a story that could relate to a kid that maybe has a gem of a memory. Because some people only need one spark. They don't need a bunch of sparks. You know what I mean? And I'm happy that these web events can spoke minute inspirations of spark. You know what I mean? Because it's hard to take in all the information. To me, I would want the future of all this stuff and the history being regurgitated to the future. Say, people, just take your time picking and choosing. You don't want to have everything be so visual when things have to be kind of more heard and felt. You know what I mean? It just makes more sense. That's why people are just musicians in the arts. Everyone's so amped to just like, let me do a Zoom studio session. Let me get back in the midst of people. Everyone wants to be back in the hearing of everything. You know what I mean? Let me hear you. I can see you, but let me hear you. And now it's easy to be heard because you can type without having a voice. It's just like,
that's
like,
pretty.
Really? You can type without having a voice and still have an image? You can still show an emoji and someone would be like, why did he send me that? Huh? Versus like, we wouldn't pay attention to none of that. Like, where we're at with it is mind-boggling to me. That's something so basic and something so raw and underground is the reason why social media has a backbone to it. It's because of punk rock and the fact that there is controversy in the world. Punk rock is a big part of it. Skateboarding is a big part of that controversy. There's a story that's being told, and I thought it was over when Glenn Friedman put out My Rules, or Discord put out Salad Days, or whoever, or Dave Grohl doing, you know, his documentary on music, which was a big thing on HBO. I thought it was
that was amazing.
It's so good, but there's still all this stuff coming out, like Shauna King doing her whole thing about the Safari Club in DC. Like, just, it's wild. You know what I mean? It's just, there just needs to be more of all of this for some reason, because I think we're missing the point if we don't let everyone know that there's a huge history behind everything that we're doing. You know what I mean? And we can't just get it from records. We got to get it from everything.
So how cold is it over there tonight?
It's a little chilly. It's windy, kind of damp, and we had like an event this Saturday, so I'm kind of burned out from it. But yeah, the weather's kind of changing. My body's not liking it.
Oh wow! What kind of event did you have?
It was a thing called skate event called COVID versus Wasted at FDR Skatepark.
Oh wow!
And so it's kind of like two teams get together, and it's an open jam format. And normally it's either drunk versus sober, or however they, you know, it's been a couple different names, but this year was COVID versus Wasted. Myself and my son Kieran, we played the halftime, you know, part of the day. It was fun. It was a long day outside.
Awesome.
So, and,
did you skate also, too, or?
Yeah, I skated a little bit, but I was just like more. I had to DJ the event plus play it, but I also was under a little bit of pressure because of I had to play music that wasn't on any labels because of the streaming, and so if you play certain songs, they'll clip, you know, the signal, and I didn't want anyone to have their signal interrupted because a lot of people were afraid to come out to the park because of the COVID situation and that, you know.
Sure.
But super fun.
Oh man, that sounds like it.
Yeah.
How old's your son?
Well, Kieran is just turned 18.
Oh wow.
And I have
okay.
another son that's like just turned 25 also, Isaac.
Oh man. Yeah. That's awesome, man.
Yeah, it's fun times.
So did your son played with you said?
Yeah, he plays drums. Like we've been jamming together, Kieran and I. My oldest son Isaac plays drums too, but he's more of a DJ producer. Like
Oh no.
style of music is called juke bounce. It's from Chicago. He's based out of Isaac is based out of Philly, LA, and New York. But
wow.
so he stopped playing drums around say 15 as far as seriously gigs and all that stuff. And then my younger son Kieran started School of Rock at like age 4. So we've been jamming since then, you know.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so since we homeschooled last year, and then we were able just kind of to build up this kind of music vibe between myself and him, just because of what was happening and what was going around, you know. Well, especially when March hit and everything changed, we had to really kind of like hone in our work schedule just so we can keep playing music. Because my whole commerce as a session musician and a skater was cut in half because of you can't get around people. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So is that been what your primary source of income has been, is as a touring musician or session musician?
Yeah, both touring and session work. In the beginning, just joining punk rock bands, I would only play or quote unquote do session work when a friend's band would ask me, hey, you were having problems with something here, bass player, guitar player, drummer. So I would get called in a lot last minute. And that kind of helped me build up confidence to eventually, say from like 83 till like 88, I had a chance to just submerge myself in punk rock and reggae and feel that all out. By 88, 89 or something like that, I started getting into just like more the aspects of songwriting. And I always would just look at the credits on records and check who was playing on the records. And then I found that there was these things called studio sessions where they would, you know, sometimes you'd have a band that was the band playing it, but then sometimes you'd have other people that would come in and guest appearance on records, or people that were just a studio group that backed up other bands. So there was all these different things that I started to learn from being in Philadelphia at the time. I was able to start working at Studio 4 to just hone in my studio chops. And Studio 4 at that time also had Rough House Records, and they had Cypress Hill, they had Crisscross, they had Schoolie D, they had a bunch of different things that were bringing in this kind of like remix studio work, because they were basically a rock studio. So I came in at the right time when rock and roll and hip hop were kind of like doing this in the music industry. And so rock guys wanted to have hip hop remixes. So since we were rock guys who understood hip hop sensibilities, we were able to do stuff with all different types of people. You know what I mean? Just big names, small names, whatever. But we had a group of studio guys who were called the A-Team, basically, in Philadelphia. It's about like 10 of us. We were able to just basically knock out anything in a day's time and, you know, help the studio be productive and also help, you know, on overhead, you know what I mean? Because we knew the quicker that we would get our jobs done and being on point and efficient, the easier it was for people to mix it and hand in and meet their deadlines, which is very crucial to because just being a studio musician is one thing, but you have to adhere to deadlines if you really want to work within any type of a production value of a system or dynasty or group of people. If they're serious about making things happen, the deadlines are so important to who you put in your chain of command and what they're doing and the whole aspect of recording. Because it's easy to say, well, I want to be a session musician, and you could do that at home. But what could easily happen is you develop unnecessary ways of collaborating and working with people if there's a uptight situation, or if you're trying to jump from one genre to the next and you think you want to use a lazy approach to anything that's going to bridge the gap to being professional. You kind of need a good work ethic and someone to work with to keep you in line. And so when you want to branch into being a studio musician in a or a group of people, you have a good sense of yourself when you're under pressure and then when it's laxed, you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's just not saying, oh, you want to be a studio musician, go ahead, just pick up your stuff, get your home recording, and then just start recording, versus like find out what people you want to work with in group settings so you have ideas to bounce off of and everyone can learn. And then also find out people that you can learn from, you know what I mean? Which is different. Certain bands are like that, but studio environments I've always learned the most because people are there saying, well, let's try this or let's try that or let's, you know, and from the wildest punk rock dude that I would have thought I would have crazy ideas recording, I've gotten all my secrets from people that are completely unknown and just love the art of recording. Like Bob Mole was my first real step into like the studio vibe because Husker Du recorded all their own records. They had this basement studio, and he goes, you know, yeah, we have a couple of Yamaha NS10s, which are these monitors were typical standard studio monitors, which were like tons of mid-range, not too much low end, good on the high end. They were typical standard studio monitors. So if you had those in your studio, regardless if you were a punk band or not, you were able to hear your sounds back clear. And what I've noticed from that is bands who took the recording process a little bit more serious, even though they were punk rock, their records ended up sounding better. Not to get off the path, but like the first Circle Jerks record, well, not the first one, Group Sex was recorded at A&M Recording Studios in Los Angeles, which is a huge, like back in the day when they recorded it, that studio was probably $1,000 a day without an engineer. But they knew for that record, if I go in there with the right engineer, we can record the record live. It's one of the best studios pretty much on the planet. And it's not going to like tarnish what we're trying to do as a punk group. When most punk groups are recording in crappy basements, and nothing, there's nothing against that. But it was more, we thought by being primal, it made us more punk rock. And then as I got older, when I would go back to the records that I grew up on, I started checking the studios, and all my favorite records were done in amazing studios by eclectic people that didn't think like regular engineers. They thought about more of a group mentality or more of a tribe mentality. Is what I'm talking about, the session musician thing. It seems like everyone had to kind of like pile in, like Ron St. Germain with the Bad Brains. He had to spend some time with them to get eye against eye and to get quickness and to get these other sounds together. But he went to the shows, he got into it. It's hard to do all that today and correctly know how to be a studio musician or a great producer because everything's so time restricted. Back in the day, you had time to get into, well, what's this whole thing about punk rock and why is it being developed and why did this person record it this way and Bob Mole does this way and Jerry Williams, why did he record the Bad Brains live for the Roar cassette? You know what I mean? There's so many different gurus inside of why I'm a studio musician, and most people would think because I listen to top 40 music, but it was because I was able to meet all these eclectic, I want to call them like aggressive hippies that just thought out of the box. And whatever was left over from the aggro hippies, they gave it to the punk rockers. You know what I mean? As far as all of our basic schooling, because they were the people that didn't judge us because we weren't rock and roll status. They were like, well, these kids have a message. And 9 times out of 10, most of us, like our first guy recording with, his name was Otto Capianco. He's a guy in North Philly, and he was just a straight Hendrix guy, great blues guitar player, great everything. But he was one of those guys that was highly into the hippie phase or hippie psychedelic phase of music, but was also open to just taking on bands and helping them. You know what I mean? And
that's cool.
It sounds sporadic because I'm all over the place, but when you're in a band, like you walk into a studio and you have your guitar, and I'm like, I got my Ibanez. Well, it wasn't an Ibanez. It was like a kick guitar, and I was playing through a PV Bandit amp or just something crappy. And what Otto did was, instead of me wasting my time and wasting our money to record our first demo, I think we had like 2 or 3 hours to record 4 songs. He immediately saw my guitar and handed me a Hamer guitar, which at that time was like, you know, a really super nice guitar. And the minute that I held it, I was like, wow, I've been struggling with this kit guitar, which is like a guitar you put together versus he knew that if you want to record a guitar, you have to have a real sounding guitar. And not that I didn't know what real instruments or music was about. It's just that punk rock kind of gave us this excuse to not dig deep and just to find what was gutter and so raw. But to get to those great, like Road to Ruin by the Ramones, there's these amazing creative people behind those records going, no, do this. And you could hear as the producers enter different people's records, the sound would change. You know what I mean? And that's what I feel, that if anyone's trying to be a studio musician, to get back to my point, is even if you're in punk rock, if you do your homework, you'll end up finding things that are probably going to give you more stability and having a direction and wanting to cross over into bigger music by doing your homework with what you understand. I never thought that I couldn't learn from punk rock and reggae and learn how to be a professional musician. I always thought that if I could understand my tribe and where I come from and the nucleus of people that I've learned how to work with through the years of experimenting and learning and growing, that's going to get me further in the studio session versus like, I know all my scales, I know all my chords, I can play everything, I can sight read everything, but when it comes to feeling a vibe or making someone feeling comfortable, I'm completely lost within like relating to myself because I'm just going by the numbers, you know what I mean? And
yeah.
I never wanted music or my session work to be that way. And every artist has that right to make that decision of how they want to be. But studio musicians, you should always strive to be unique because you're going to be playing on a lot of records and your identity may get caught up in it and your identity may not get caught up in it. You know what I mean? But you have to realize that you have to kind of give up a certain amount of power as a studio musician because it's someone else's vision and it's someone else's dream and you're helping them put more gas in the engine to make sure the car goes straight. You know what I mean?
Sure,
versus like,
yeah.
So, you know, it's just like versus like being a deer on the road, you're kind of being the engine and the transmission. And the person shifting the gears is whoever's doing that. But the engine, the foundation of a session musician, you have to run on all cylinders at all times and keep your ego in your back pocket. And a lot of people sometimes find that hard, but that's what makes a great team. And that's what makes a great kind of overall foundation of why you can have a long time career in being a session musician, if you can practice and always learn. But if you're expecting to be accepted as a musician, it's better to be a songwriter so you can fit in with how you're growing instead of being, oh, this guy plays like this. And if you get into a session, you may have to jump on a level that you're not because you can't regulate what opportunities are coming to you. It's too much competition. You know what I mean? You have to jump in where you jump in, you know, or someone says, okay, this guy's not serious, call the next person. So your first call on a session may be the one that keeps you in or kicks your ass right out. You know what I mean? Long-winded, but I just wanted to let people know that there's so many different sides of painting the picture of what a session musician's about, but it's all about if you can relate kind of like your youthfulness into who you are as you're expressing yourself with your art and not take it personal if someone likes it or not, doesn't like it, then you can be a great session musician, you know what I mean? Because then you can create and then stand back and say, well, it's not my music. I can just learn from hearing all this different music and applying myself to it in the moment.
Awesome, man. Do you have any idea of how many records you've played on at this point?
Probably, I would say since 83, maybe 5,000, maybe more.
Oh, wow.
Done so many sessions, you know, it was just something that you want to do something and then it just starts happening. But if I were to count all the studio sessions, including the ones from my first record, I'd probably be up in the 5,000s, you know, maybe more, because Philadelphia is such a tight nucleus that there was days where I would do 4 sessions in one day because I was a session musician, and it goes back to the punk ethos. I would go and work with Eric Victor from Creep Records, and we would be in his basement near Westchester, just, you know, work myself, Ben Kenny, you know, Fred Mascherino from Taking Back Sunday, Brody, like all of us were in the same kind of studio environment, but it was in a punk rock setting. And then I would immediately go to Studio 4, which was like more record label, more traditional, more like you're walking in the studio and there's an ultimate, like, you know, you have to perform vibe. You know what I mean? So it's like I was able to learn from all aspects of it and also be able to have options of like friends calling, being like, yo, I have something going on. And I wouldn't be like, oh, I'm on this big studio platform. I don't want to go down to the punk rock studio. I was excited to go from the bigger echelon studios back down to the punk studios. And then I would show those guys what I would learn in the bigger studios, you know, and then we'd all
Yeah.
exchange. And it turned out to be a really cool dynamic, because if you're, I mean, you got 24 hours a day, you're spending like maybe 10 to 15 hours at most sometimes in sessions when you're really working them. But if you can think about it the right way, you can actually do a multitude of session work and get all sorts of education, because there's so many different people recording music, you know, and now with everyone online, I mean, you can literally hop, if you're capable of doing things and not burning yourself out, you're capable of learning at a very quick rate how to deal with people and different styles of music, because of the fact that there's just a need for talented people out there who understand sensibilities and how music is created, how it's put together. I think it's completely a rush to go from playing a straight pop session to going right into, like, you got to play just a straight hardcore beat, and there's no click track, there's no nothing, and the guys want you to vibe the track. You know, they worked it out with a certain musician and it didn't work, and so they're calling you because they know that you're going to come in and slam it. And I felt like that's a challenge, because the gear is different, the vibe is different in a punk studio. Not that all punk studios are crappy, but you have to use your imagination. If the headphone mix is not right, you have to adjust. It's just like being on a punk stage. You're not going to hear the guitar player and the bass player every show. Something's going to change. I mean, like, how dedicated are you to your art and your cause when you can't get the full picture? So that's why I wanted to have different studios and in my repertoire of recording, and also my experience of those different studios in my repertoire of recording. You know what I mean? I just didn't want to be like, I went here and I took pictures. I was like, no, we were here. I remember, like, when we started with one tape machine, and then we went to the next tape machine, this band and that band. You know, I can actually get into the process of how bands were making their records, but also keeping their punk rock ethos or their pop rock or reggae ethos within. I never tried to strip anybody's identity from them just because I had knowledge of self within music. Never. You know, it was always about helping the person and visualize what they were trying to do.
Trying to bring out the best of what their vision was.
Yeah, and it really goes back to Bob Mould, because he was telling me, like, it's me that's creating all my guitar tones. It's me that's sitting there engineering all the records and the rest of the band. But it's like, we have a very small room, a very basic sound. And when you listen to those Everything Falls Apart, that record, I mean, that's all Bob Mould. His guitar sound is him. I mean, that's like his blood, sweat, and tears of sitting under those monitors, getting your ears pegged like there's somebody like shoving metal noodles in your brain cells. I mean, you're listening to music over and over and over, and those records were done all to tape. There was no digital editing or formatting. So those guys were having to cut it, mix it, do everything, make sure it's ready. And then when they blew up, it was hard for me to understand, but it was also easier for me to understand, because once I understood the studio process, I was like, wow, Husker Du really created their own sound. They're probably one of the first bands that didn't have a major producer to make their greatest records. I think Zen Arcade was probably the first time they maybe used an outside producer, but I think everything before that was all Bob Mould, Greg, and Grant.
They're incredible, and they've done incredible things, you know, on their own too.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah, Bob Mould is an amazing, what he did with Sugar, and
very serious guy.
Yeah, he's seriously good. Well, let's kind of talk about, you know, so you're talking about, you know, like transitioning, you know, the different types of music, and you could almost, you know, I think probably relate that with, you know, skating in a large, you know, thing, you know, way, in terms of, like, you know, going from, you know, like you're talking about a well-produced pop record, you know, talking about, like, you know, in a manicured skate park where everything's nice and smooth and everything flows, and then, you know, going back out to the streets, you know, and, you know, where you got rocks everywhere, you got people trying to chase you out, you know, public spaces, and, you know, and I could see, you know, that being a natural extension of that mindset. You know, if you've grown, you know, this is how you skate, this is where your head's at, and then you just carry that over into your musical endeavors.
Pretty much so, yeah.
Yeah, that kind of how it goes in your head there.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like the process of, if I were to compare music and skateboarding, like back, so I'm like 56 now, so I was born in 64, started playing drums at age 6, so by like early 70s, I was starting to get into music, which was like this open, free, you know, my parents listened to everything. They were just kind of like, once again, the hippie R&B rock. They had Janis Joplin from to Aretha Franklin. You know what I mean? As far as like,
That's
just
awesome.
people. Another reason why I picked two female artists is because most people go, they had from Jimi Hendrix to James Brown, or just something. But
yeah.
if you're growing up in a house and you're hearing Aretha Franklin, and all of a sudden you're hearing Janis Joplin, your mind is going to go like, whoa, like tripped out. So
yeah, totally.
That's the early 70s. And the early 70s with skateboarding was free, new, the hippie style and the psychedelic style was all in it. And then once everyone got over the freeness of it and things got dark, all of a sudden we started noticing that skateboard parks were important, which is like, this is like age 16. So it's probably like what, 78, 79-ish. Everything just collapses. Skateboarding is considered corny, totally falls off the face of the earth as far as being accepted. You know what I mean? I've been watching friends quit, and music kind of goes through a different change to where instead of it being like the typical classic rock and roll, like new wave and punk rock are coming in, but it's not coming in. It's coming in on a label side, and it had a little support, but it's not coming in as far as integrating the rock kids with the punk kids. In the day, the rock kids and the metal kids and the punk kids are all integrated. Back in the day, it wasn't. So the roughness of the music industry, when new wave and Devo and all that stuff was coming in, and the early Black Flag was coming in, it was kind of like rough concrete. And if you wanted to be in the punk rock era and be accepted, you had to know what that rough concrete lifestyle was, which means your friends were going to make fun of you. For going to those shows, they were going to make fun of you about the records. They were going to make fun of you about your clothes, everything, because it wasn't the super 70s. Like, whoa, it was more aggressive and dark because things were starting to get, it was before the Reagan era, you know what I mean? Things were starting to get taken away by, different powers that be, you know what I mean? And skateboarding had the same vibe. It had all the parks, and then all of a sudden parks went away and we had the streets. But for some reason we had a soundtrack with that. And so that's why, to me, skateboarding and music and the glitzy, the gleaming the cube of it, to make a skateboard reference, the thrashing of it or the daggers of it was amazing, but it had to kind of like die off to be rekindled into, the Black Flag, the SOA, the Minor Threats, the Void, the Circle Jerks, the Ill Reputes, just the China White, just the whole like decline of Western civilization, where punk bands it was more anarchy in the UK stuff, more or less, whatever, Homicide. Just when Decline came out, it was just it related so much to me with skateboarding that I was like, if I don't grasp this right now, I'm going to be so on the outside, because the only thing that's left that's kind of halfway unique is rock and roll, and rock and roll was about to turn into hair metal. And most skaters, unless you really were musicians and really loved that, you didn't really gravitate towards it because it wasn't accepted heavily in skating. Unless you closet were just like a shredder and you knew that it was great to have all that hair metal on it. We were just more into the rawer sides of why, not to jump again, but it's weird how skateboarding, punk rock isn't the dominant music in skateboarding anymore. It's so eclectic now.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's all over the place.
That would have never flown back in the day, because I remember getting crap for playing a reggae tape at a skate contest. And what is this? I'm like, what do you mean, what is this? It's like, at our once, I was lucky growing up in Philly. You're in this eclectic environment where, luckily, when everything was thrown on the streets, music and skating, that we had all these creative people still making the underground happy. We just thought that the overground was the better place to be, so that's why we made the underground. But we were just afraid to get to the overground at the early age, because they weren't accepting of us where we were coming from. So the rough streets and the rough skate parks, and after the gloss, made us redefine and recreate what music was and what that lifestyle was. And when you go back to the early 80s and you start following it through the Zorlak phase and the Pushead phase, and how Pushead influenced Metallica, and Danzig, and just that movement alone not that it couldn't happen today, but when it was happening, it was so heavy for all of us that we were just like, we have to get our art better. We see Pushead pulling us out of the darkness into what's creative. And Shepherd Ferry, you know, I got the first fanzine, the first Obey, you know, just when it came through, and I'm like, why is he using Andre the Giant? I'm like, he's turning punk rock into what we grew up on. This whole rough, you know, kind of thrown around wrestling thing, which would have never ever really worked. But for some reason, because someone put it back into a fanzine mode, which skaters can relate to, they were like, no, I love Andre the Giant. He's the guy. He's the big guy. He's kind of like he's like the sleeping giant within all of us. And it still holds, but it had to come from that, like, that gritty, like, we're recreating something. And then certain people, you know, even in Spike Jones, like, he started out as a skate photographer. He took some of my favorite photos. You know, he's you know, he's untouchable right now, but back in the day, he started the skate photographer, you know, working for, I think it was Homeboy Magazine, shooting BMX and skating. I didn't know he came from a wealthy family. And if he did, I wouldn't care. He was there earning his keep. He wasn't there being like, I'm this wealthy, rich kid. He was there with us when we were excited to see that there was a backyard ramp or a new bowl, like, or Spike just happened to be at this contest somewhere in the South, and he's snapping pictures of everybody. He's not playing favorites. If something catches his eye, he's gonna get it. You know, and it was amazing for me to see him develop his whole character out of our world. You know, Jason Lee is the same way. I mean, not Jason Lee, but Jason Lee from Stereo. I think how he turned his.
Yeah, now he's a professional photographer, releasing these amazing books.
Yeah, so it's this. I think that world is super important, because if we were handed everything but still had to learn how to be judged by people that didn't want to accept us, we wouldn't have had those records. We wouldn't have had the scene. There would have been no reason for Thrasher. Skateboarder magazine would have still been around. You know, it wouldn't have went Skateboarder, Action Now, and then Thrasher had to save it as being kind of like a big fanzine that kind of brought us back up into, well, you don't have to have your fanzine small. The first Thrashers were like, they looked like big old posters, but they were made like fanzines. You know what I mean? They just figured like, well, let's just take the ethos of where everyone's at and just make it bigger. And everyone's like, oh, we can do things bigger. It's just the weirdest. I don't think it's hard to find identity if you don't have a sense. I don't want to use the word struggle. I just think if you can't creatively learn how to like replenish what you used to have into something new and different.
It's definitely that idea of synthesizing, you know, maybe two disparate ideas or two, you know, things that don't seem like they go together, and bring them together to create something new that, you know.
It's hard to keep up today if you wanted to be unique and eclectic, because someone can see you making our small increments have more time to develop because we were physically mailing things to people. We were dialing rotary phones. We were happy to have a beep boop 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 touch phone and different things. And the fact that you got excited when you had your first wireless phone in your house and you could walk around without stretching the cord. I mean, it's stuff that I remember, the basics of it. And I think that we applied so much of that into our music that today it's hard to take the digital world and put it inside your music, other than you can get it out quicker, you can make your production better. But how do you create a unique lifestyle? Because the minute that you post something, even if it's your smallest increment of growing, someone's there to analyze it. So you have to make sure that everything you're posting is something that you want to post when you're learning and growing, because there has to be some mystique to people. And if everything is out in the light, there's no mystique. You just see what it is, and you almost kind of know what someone's going to do before they do it, versus like a part of what it was like to see a punk rock band or going to see a skate demo back in the day was you didn't know every video part, and you didn't know everybody's tricks and everyone's lines. You got blown away because you had to go there and get through the struggle to get to those places, to get to see those people, create it. Then you had to internalize it, take it back home, try to emulate it, or have somebody with a big ass VHS camera to make tapes, and all of that plays so much into why Tony Hawk and all these other people developed this new style of digital situation that's happening now. I'm just trying to figure out if people are going to be able to keep their lifestyles as unique and mystique with all of this exposure. You know what I mean? Because we can interpret and learn so quick, but will there ever be an underground scene again? You know what I mean? Truly.
Yeah.
And a scene that we can say has time to develop without us poking fingers in it and going, what the hell is this? Because I mean, anyone can poke fingers in anything now because we have access to do that. Like, we were left alone as much as we were complaining about Reagan back in the day and supporting maximum rock and roll and different things that were Jello Biafra, his whole stint, and MDC. Like, we had time to internalize it. Now, if you say something racing, you have like people on you.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Everything.
And depending on the format you're saying it on, people could really be on you.
Yes.
Immediately. You know, you can have cops showing up at your house immediately. True. You know, even if I started ranting right now, I mean, there's someone, you know, overseeing what we're doing. So my whole thing is just that, why don't I just keep me as eclectic as I can, knowing that I'm using a tool that I never had before. And we're able to spit this history back into, hey guys, you can emulate this. Maybe you may have to take some time off of social media just to gather yourself and not put up everything.
Yes.
You know, if you want to have a sense of like, you can make a week feel like a month on social media if you just take some time to develop and just post different things away from your creativity, just to give people a different insight about how you can grow. But you know what I'm saying? That's more or less what I'm kind of like comparing the roughness of skateboarding, the start of it, into where we are now and how they compare to music. And for some reason, for me, they both lined up because we were able to have a chance to grow within the styles of music and how they changed and the clothing. It wasn't so like, oh my God, that person's doing something and they're in Indonesia, excuse me. And I could see it right now. It's like, we had to be like, I got this 45 and it was sent to me from a friend because we were on a random skate trip, and this guy was from England, and it's nothing for them to get something from Italy because they're right over there. It's like a 2-hour plane flight. You know what I mean? For us, it was like, oh my God, I never heard of Raw Power. Like, who? You know what I mean? Just weirdness how we found out about bands for some reason. It was way more of a community-based effort that took time to make sure that whatever we were listening to was thought out. And really, like, if someone was passing on information back in the day, it's because they really honestly did their homework. And it wasn't just like a fever frenzy of like, this is a new hot thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and it kind of also made it I'm a few years younger. And so, my formative years were like in the late 80s, early 90s, with the explosion of grunge and all that stuff. But there was still that sense of, you're discovering something that isn't, mainstream, that, not, you've got a small circle that, feels like this is speaking to you and not to the wider world. And there was something so magical about that, where you'd pass around a tape that, you're like, oh man, check this out. No one's playing this, but this will change your life, man.
Right.
And, now, I mean, you've got, people, billions of streams on Spotify, and, it's, I can't even fathom that. Like, my favorite bands, they would never get that kind of play.
No. Yeah, it was Danny Diablo today was on his live, from Crown of Thorns, and he was just talking about the New York. He called it the New York curse, and I wanted to call it like the New York experience, because back in the day, for a band from Philly to have to play CB's, you had to play A7's first, which is a smaller club in New York. And normally when you played that club, it was like 2 or 3 people there, because New York at that time was you had to be a part of the ethos, you know what I mean, to get New York people out to your show. And so my friend was like, yo, come back, let's play CB's. And I remember when we were playing CB's, it just felt like, oh, we have an audience, but they were still like, oh, you guys are not from New York City. You're not from the Lower East Side. You're from Philly. And I remember when we played CB's the first time, I was 19. I had already been playing in like a couple different punk bands and some cover bands. So I had my professionalism together. But when we were playing our hardcore, they were kind of into it, but they didn't accept us. But the minute we dropped reggae, like, everybody in the club lost it. And I still have a recording of that show. I'll email you a copy of that section of the show. Jerry Williams was doing sound that night, and he's the person who recorded the Roar cassettes for Bad Brains. So he knew exactly what to do, and we knew that he was a sound guy, and he was involved with the sound of the Bad Brains, the whole live thing and aggressive punk and the dub. So we knew that, like, okay, if Jerry's doing sound, when we go into the reggae, we're going to nail it. And the funniest thing about it, the age of the band at that time was, I was 19, the bass player Zeke was 15, and the other two guys in the band were 16. So you get a bunch of teenagers on stage. We were clearly, because of living in Philly, we were just surrounded by reggae music. So we were just the kids who wanted to have that in our sound. And that, for some reason, helped us bridge that New York gap. And we would have never known that if we would have never taken a chance to eclectically get ourselves into our scene and learn everything about it and realize, like, okay, we're out of town band, but we have something that we may drop on this scene that could turn their heads. Instead of looking at a phone going, this is what this scene likes and we can see it, we had to kind of guesstimate it into, why don't we just take all of our influences, put it into our band, and let's just hope that we make the best decisions without having any visual format of, like, reassurance of what we're doing is right. To get that first acceptance as a kid in New York City at CBGB's playing reggae music made me realize, like, wow, this whole thing about New York, it's like, it's our thing. Because I was there, CB's in the 80s, early 80s, but I was also there the last week of the Bad Brain shows. And I'm talking to Eddie from Leeway, and there's people walking by Eddie and I, and they're not even concerned that it's Eddie from Leeway and myself. They're like walking out of pieces of the bathroom and bricks. And I mean, I was just petrified to go in those bathrooms. And people were literally walking out with pieces of that disgusting bathroom.
Holy cow.
Because of how much that club meant to them. Today, that would be a COVID, you would be quarantined.
It's so disgusting.
If those people were put on the list who grabbed that shit. I mean, like, that bathroom was so disgusting. And I'm looking at Eddie and we're talking to him, like, dude, people are walking out of here with bathroom. Like, they're so hooked on this club. Like, we can't do that today. You know what I mean? Like,
Nope.
We have lost a part of what made punk rock so special. And it's not that we need to make those mistakes again and go in these dilapidated buildings that you've grown up in and say, hey, when it goes, the memorabilia is stuff that could basically kill you chemically. You know what I mean?
Like, asbestos filled and who knows what else.
They didn't care about it. And it was like, that's what made me realize that from being there as a kid to the last week of the Bad Brain shows, and me playing one of those shows and then getting to roadie those shows and seeing people still kill themselves, like grown men still moshing, still the same floor, still the same wood, the same plywood. I was like, if we didn't do that, if we didn't have that, what Danny said, that New York curse on us, we would have never had, we would have just, it would have washed out. Just like the early part of skateboarding and the early part of, like, kind of rock and roll really washed out. Like Bob Dylan and Neil Young and those guys saved that sort of rock and roll, but it was because of their songwriting. I think our lifestyle saved what we had because we believed in it so much that it was never supposed to be, Bad Brains were never supposed to be a mainstream band like sort of what Living Colour was trying to exist and be. They just had the spark of the push of MTV, but Living Colour never had the push of what CBGB's could give you, because when CBGB's closed down, every band that played there that was originally attached to that punk ethos, from like Blondie on to, basically Biohazard or Prong, or even, Living Colour. Living Colour just didn't stay in that ethos, but the bands that stayed in that ethos, they all went back to play CB's that last month they were open. I mean, and the big bands too, but it's amazing that we have something that most rock bands don't really talk about, their original clubs that they played, unless it's the Troubadour, in LA or some.
Yeah, Whiskey a Go-Go.
Whiskey a Go-Go, which is like the typical staples. I mean, you can't help it. I mean, it's just a staple in itself. But it's hard, to compare the beginnings of rock and roll to what our beginnings were of punk rock, because most people consider it a curse because we weren't accepted on a bigger platform, but I don't think the bigger platform was ever it wasn't the right illusion for what we had to do to keep it core. It would have floated right away with everything else if punk rock was considered the hula hoop. You know what I mean? If Johnny Rotten would have been an alternate pop star, you know what I mean? Like he went from Sex Pistols to Public Image Limited, which is like today it would be hard for a band to do that. You know what I mean? To go from like straight fuck the Queen to just like, you know, flowers of romance and you know, big beats and Keith Levine and all this really intertwined sort of curse that what Danny's talking about is kind of like it's like our underground railroad that most scenes don't have. It's a visible, because you can go back and see after, you know, well, basically you would say after MC5 or Death.
True. Velvet Underground.
Or the original Muddy Waters or, you know, Electric.
Going back even further.
All of that. After those guys, punk started to become more visible in the political scene. That's why it started making a ruckus. But the blown up sound, the crunchy amps, those guys were doing that because amps were blowing up and they didn't have technicians and digital amps. And, you know, these guys are noticing, they were discovering punk rock, but applying it to a rock and roll world. We were discovering punk rock and just applying it to a political world. You know what I mean? We weren't doing anything that was sonically new. It was already done. It just hadn't been packaged with a new vocal message. Like, why is this happening? You know, why are we seeing this? You know what I mean? Why can't we all get along? Why can't we? John Lennon took it to one level, but why does Jello make sense? Why does Johnny Ramone make sense? You know what I mean? Like, there's so many different ways of how the Ramones could be a political statement just as much as Jello Biafra. You know, the Ramones were like, dress down, wear jeans. Everybody looks the same. All the songs are as fast as you can possibly be and just play till you can't play anymore. Versus like the rock star thing is like, be a rock star, you know, emulate the rock starism, always change your image and just try to keep people guessing of why they can't be you. The Ramones made their political statement is like, you can be you. You know, you can do whatever. You don't have to always point the finger at somebody else. You could say, I can take old school R&B and doo-wop and put it to punk rock and keep playing faster, and people are going to sing those songs forever. It's like, it's noted that, you know, Joey and Johnny and all those guys, they loved early surf music, early rock and roll, early classic.
They're huge fans of like the Ronettes and the Phil Spector's Wall of Sound.
And their lifestyle politically in New York at that time was desolate. So what are those kids going to do but be that? And then they have all these influences and that are so important to why punk rock became a political format outside of the musical format, because not everybody in punk rock wanted to be so attached to the music until they learned that they needed to make better sounding records to expand their audience, not to even be accepted on a bigger platform like the Grammys or the fact that certain bands are getting nominated Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, or the Bad Brains did get nominated Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Bad Brains records are just as good or powerful as any rock record. They're just not accepted on a platform of being like public, just kind of chatter. You know, it's more like underground, like, yo, take this piece of paper, read it and see if you understand. What do you mean? Read it and see if you can understand it. Because if you don't get the message of punk rock, if you don't get the verbal political message of what we're saying right now, we're not capable of handling someone that's just here for the music. You know, your patches have to be kind of right. You should know what, you know, 1-2-XU means. You know, you should know what that song "Guilty of Being White" means. What do you mean? Like, like Minor Threat didn't make any sense to you guys? Oh, I never saw him. You're just into the records, aren't you? Like what we had political options in punk rock that were outside of the music. You know, the music side and the pop punk of punk rock was always there. Billy Idol, Generation X, it was always there. But not every band's going to want to say "Kiss Me Deadly" and make sense out of it. Not every punk band can write a love song and make sense out of it, and Be the Descendants or Milo Goes to College, or Liveage. I think the political thing gave punk rock's legs forever, but it made us not be acceptable in that other bigger light where political bands like, you know, Fela or anyone else, they just got shunned. You know what I mean? And they had no room when they wanted to be accepted by playing the crowds over 5,000 people. You know, it seems like once you get over the 5,000 to 10,000 mark, people just want to start to regulate what you're saying and what you're doing. And everyone's tried to fight it, from Prince to, Sinead O'Connor. And they all get, I don't want to say silenced, they all get pushed to the side because you're
marginalized.
Yeah, you're dealing with a different level of money and a different level of comprehending, which could lead someone to say, we're never going to be on that level. But that level's not the right illusion for us. We don't need to be there, because once they don't understand this, they're going to wash it away because they didn't start. We needed to create the Spike Joneses and the Mickey from Ween and all these different people. You know what I mean?
Ween is so good. I forgot Ween is from Philadelphia, aren't they?
Yeah, Mickey's a great friend of mine. I mean,
no way.
Yeah. I've played on like a couple of Moist Boys recordings, and there's a record that I'm on, and we've done a bunch of shows where he does, the Dean Ween and Friends, and I've spent a lot of time recording with Mickey and understanding his process. And once again, he goes back to that, like, if I'm tracking, Chuck, we're gonna run through this once and track it once. That's it. I want to do it again. Mickey, nope. he's tracking bass in the room live with me. Like all the recordings we've done, he's playing bass, but he's got an SVT and a drum kit in the same room, and we're cranked playing, and he knows what he's doing on bass before he even tracks his guitar. But
that's amazing.
Stuff I've seen. Mickey is just so out of touch, but he doesn't forget that punk rock ethos. And no one from outside of Ween would ever know how Mickey records, because the record sounds so thought out. But the reason why they're so thought out is because the foundation, he's coming from where he exists. He's a punk rock kid from New Hope, Pennsylvania, that grew up loving the Dead Milkmen and watching us play when we were early. I mean, he was just one of those guys, him and his, the other guy who started, Ween. They went to a bunch of shows. They were there. They weren't not there. They were into the message of it. They just found out that living in New Hope was more eclectic, more hippie, they were able to just they were the only scene in Pennsylvania to keep the hippie vibe within rock and roll and punk rock, because the scene was tight and small and integrated to where there was more money and more art going into the New Hope scene, which created why Ween is so important to a lot of different people, because they had the access to have good gear, different people around, but they didn't get too much backlash by being, these guys just want to play this really angsty music and talk about all this crazy, crazy shit. But when you really pull apart Mickey's process, it's really heavy. The guy's really studied and done his homework, but it's a punk rock ethos. Like the whole process of what I'm talking about, he helped me rekindle that within the way I recorded.
Wow.
He kept me from being overly nitpicking at things.
Yeah.
He's like, I don't want a record like that. I don't need records like that. They can do that. And,
it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's the person, if you ever can if Mickey does decide to do any of these web things, I hope that you can get a chance to talk with him, because he's got so much valuable information. I'm more scatterbrained because I'm so excited about music, and I've had a chance to learn from these people, and they're in my backyard. You know what I mean? It's like, we would be jamming right now, but COVID has got us all separate. You know what I mean? The club that we were in, John and Peters, is a small club. It holds about maybe 100 people, and we have jam sessions there almost every Wednesday, and we are able to do and play and relate. And it's a bug out that I have to talk about something that I'm used to being involved with. That's why I'm just so tripping, because it's like I'd rather be sitting in a room with Mickey going like, yo, you know what I mean? Not to
right.
talking, you know what I'm saying? It's
I get it. Trust me.
The records and the scene is so good, but the fact of the matter is there's people that, I mean, if your mind is right, you're going to meet the right gurus showing you how to still take your foundation of your youth and applying it to bigger things. And Mickey's a classic person for that, for me. You know what I mean?
Wow. That's so cool, man. Well, so I want to talk about, so you were talking about, so like you started playing in '83. What was your first band? Was it McRad, or did that come later?
81-ish, 11th grade, had a band called Jerry's Kids. There was Jerry's Kids from Boston, but before I even heard of Boston Not LA compilation, myself, another friend I skated with at Cherry Hill Skatepark, his name was Mark Minuti. He played guitar. His brother Joe Minuti sang, and a friend of ours, Kenny, played drums. And we just did Clash covers, punk rock covers. There was another band in Delaware. I lived in Delaware at that time, called the Subversives. So there was like 2 punk bands that were just kind of like floating around the scenes. This is like early, I mean, it's 81, so it was raw. And that band lasted for a while, but I probably would have stayed in Delaware, but because our local skate park closed down when I was like age 16, we had to kind of pick and choose what scene we wanted to be in if we wanted to be vibrant within music and skateboarding. So Delaware was just a smaller town. I didn't know to utilize the beach towns for business because my head wasn't like, yo, I should learn how to go and sell to people at the beach because there's more foot traffic there and people are going to buy t-shirts. You know, I was just more or less like, let me get out of Delaware, get into Philly. I don't need a car. I can take the subway. I can get to the shows. I can make all this stuff work and learn how to rekindle what I want out of my music and my life. You know what I mean? It's just, the whole process is pretty unique within itself. And I don't know if I've gotten off the beaten path of what you were trying to ask, because I've totally
That's okay.
based on it. But I think could you repeat the question that you were asking again?
I was just wondering about your first band, and then
So it gets back to the first band. The reason why I moved to Philly is because Delaware wasn't as a developed scene, and because of a lot of the oppression and stuff that is happening, I would say now that people are experiencing with like police brutality and the typical things you would deal with in Delaware, that if you were a punk rocker, somebody was going to scream out their windows and just some nasty shit. And so we decided, well, let's just go to a show in Philly and see what it's like. And so a friend of mine took me to a show in Philly, and I was like, whoa. And I was always go to Philly because my mom lived in Philly. But when you're there in West Philly, there weren't that many punk rock shows. So my friends started taking me to different things. And then my 11th grade year, after my punk band, I started looking into Philadelphia to see what it was like. And I realized, oh, there's a small scene up here. Like there's a couple of skateboarders and everyone's on the street. You can literally just put your skateboard on the street in Philly and go 50 blocks and ride through all these neighborhoods and meet all these different people, because it's just the city's set up just like a grid. It's like, left to right, east to west, north to south. I mean, it's simple. And I was like, wow, I can really make sense of the city and not have to always worry about being in a car. I can actually get myself together, not have to go to college, which in 82 at that time, when I finally moved to Philly, it was the typical person was going to university. And if you didn't, people looked down on you like, why do you just want to do the skateboarding thing and music thing? It's dead.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, it's not dead. It's just that it's dead in areas that aren't accepting the people that are about having their own culture. It's not just a pop thing anymore. It's not the hippie thing. It's not the surfer thing altogether. It's got to go back to the streets. Like ethnic people have to join in the skateboarding thing, not just in California, but in places in the Midwest, and everything has to just get changed around. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
that's the main reason why I moved into Philly and why my first band didn't become as known as McRad, because McRad was built in Philly. It was built around arts. Our bass player, his last name is Zagar. His father is Isaiah Zagar, who does all the Brooklyn mosaic work in Philly. So if you look up I's Gallery and you look up Isaiah Zagar, he has been a artist that was kind of a hippie vagabond artist way back in the 70s. And it took him years to be accepted. But Isaiah was there as my father was there, as a musician in my life. Isaiah was the artist, my dad, the musician. Isaiah was there at Cherry Hill Skatepark when Zeke and I skated. And at that time, Zeke had to be 10 and I was 15. So I was able to see this Zeke's father show up at the skate park dressed in weird clothes and out there stuff. back in the day in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, which was not a weird place. But he was one parent that didn't care, that went against the system, that was more punk rock than any other parents. And we were just starting to understand the music and, once again, the politics of punk rock. Isaiah was on the art side of punk rock. Like, I'm going to keep doing my art. And my art is all about breaking up what the city, the rubble of the city, and putting it into his own structures. So if you look at any of his art, you'll see what I mean. But it's really eclectic, and us as kids having our own kind of Andy Warhol, you know what I mean, without the drugs, without all the pressure of what New York could bring being an artist. We were able to learn as kids because they had already set up a business on South Street, and they were already able to show us how to sell our ideas back to the people that we related to. And we didn't even know that was happening. But looking back on it now, I was like, wow, we were able to sit out in front of Eyes Gallery with our vinyl at age 19, age 15. And just because we were sitting on the street, they would let kids sit on the street back then, and people started buying our records because we were bold enough to sit on the street and be like, hey, we just recorded our first punk rock record. And people were like, yeah. And then we ended up winning Best Local Rock Group in 1984, which we weren't a rock group, we were just a punk group. But because we learned how to present ourselves through art and through someone that had angst with art, like Isaiah to us was our first real punk rock savior. And if I wouldn't have moved to Philly, I wouldn't have experienced that, because I wouldn't have been like, oh, Zeke, we skated at Cherry Hill, and now I'm in Philly and we're friends. It would have been like, oh, Zeke, I live in Delaware, why don't you come here? You know, it's like, they'd be like, no, Philly people don't want to go to Delaware. Philly people want to stay in Philly. Like, you know what I mean? Like, as DC people want to, you know, you travel. McRad being the first band that people know from me is because the fact that art was so important to all of us, and Isaiah was so important to all of us, first and foremost. I mean, we don't give Isaiah enough credit, but he really helped us hone in why you have art and why you have a purpose and why you put things together and why you regentrify. Like, I learned all that from him. He was the first to start buying properties and building up South Street. There used to be 20, 30 abandoned houses on South Street. We used to be in them all the time, doing drugs, doing whatever. We're all Philly. And Isaiah was like, I'm going to take this art and this money and start taking my art and doing the art that I do outside on buildings, inside. So he's got houses with mosaics like on every floor. And it's just, and some of this work is like, what, 20 plus years old, 30 years old. And it's still, for some reason, his plaster work and all of his work is still holding up today. It's like, it's amazing that we had such a platform to learn from, and we didn't even know it. You know what I mean? We didn't. And once again, it's about moving. Not that you have to move around to get experiences, but if I were to stay in Delaware and say my first band was Jerry's Kids, it would have never given me the insight to start McRad, because McRad was started from a musical thing, but it was started from because we were in a punk rock environment, and we were just young kids going, this is all we have. We don't want to be a part of the regular thing. We want to pay the $5 and see if we can go to the show. And if we're not 21, we want to see if we can sneak in the show. The whole Philly experience back in the 80s, it was like you had to move there to get that experience. It was like kids that weren't there, you missed Minor Threat at Love Hall for the first time. Luckily, we were there. It was our first show. You know, the first show was opening up for them, you know, and a bunch of
holy cow.
Yeah, it's because all the guys who skated wanted to start booking shows. And we started this thing called Skatecore, which is a BYOB of kind of like what they started out, you know, in California. You know, we just realized we had a group of us that skated together. We had Love Hall, which we did shows. And so they said, well, if you get bands together, you know, we'll help you bring your identity up to the forefront. It's the artist vibe.
That's amazing. So McRad, I guess, is probably your most famous band. How did you get hooked up with the Powell Peralta team?
Oh, getting hooked up with Stacey and Powell Peralta, I was always a fan of Stacey's, and I read an interview with him in Skateboarder when I was like probably age 14. I wrote a letter to him and didn't think that he would write back, and he wrote back all in handwriting, and he basically said that I'm going to start this thing called the Bones Brigade. It's not going to be anything like any other skate team ever. It's not a skate team. It's just a bunch of guys I mean, basically, he was basically writing me a vision board, which most people wouldn't even do today, which is like his whole plan of what Bones Brigade was. He wrote it out in a letter to me, and he was like, I know you skated Cherry Hill, and we have on our team two of your local skaters, which is guy Jamie Godfrey and Mike Jezalowski, and we had already known that they were been on PAL, but he was just being nice enough to say, you know, Jamie and Mike are a part of it, and we really appreciate that we have West Coast people, East Coast people, we have some people that we're going to get from Europe, but this is our thing. And so from age 14, basically I stayed in touch with Stacey through the years, and when I was able to form McRad, Stacey had already known me from age 14 to 19, so I'd already had a 5-year relationship with him just by keeping in touch with him. And so when we had a chance to record a record, which is Absence of Sanity in 1986, Stacey had a chance to do the soundtrack for Savannah Slammer, which is a huge video. And he put all the bands from Beware Records, which is Drunk Engines, which is Mofo's band from Thrasher, and Steve Caballero had a band called Odd Man Out. And there's a bunch other, I think 1 or 2 other bands, but Stacey just put the whole soundtrack and all the bands that were out on that label into Savannah Slammer. And that gave us light because that was the first big East Coast contest. That was, once again, one of the first big breaks around what kind of gave McRad the boost, because our record was out, but we didn't have a platform or an identity to kind of have an agenda to promote it. We were just kind of like, we're on this thing. It's involved with Thrasher Records. It's my truck sponsor, Thunder Trucks. What's going to push it over the top? And then Stacey, luckily, just said, you know what? I have an underground prophecy here. Maybe I should just take this and put this to a visual thing. And Savannah Slammer turned into basically public domain because Weakness was in Savannah Slammer and McShred. And I guess because of the feedback that he received from Savannah Slammer when he was editing public domain, he was like, people are really attaching themselves to these songs. So he was able to put these 2 songs in that footage before I even knew it. Like I went to the video premiere and didn't even know my music was in it as far as public domain. Because I went to LA for the premiere, and when I saw the footage, I was like, wow, like Stacey really saw something inside McRad that I couldn't even picture. Once again, it's back to the lifestyle thing. It wasn't about being a musician. It was about what's going to fit the footage, what's going to fit what's inside here, and how can I work with musicians? It's weird to say that. How can I work with music that's going to be almost, I don't want to say sample free, but risk free of having any problems? Because you couldn't go to a big rock band and be like, I want your soundtrack in my video, because they're going to ask for crap tons of money because they know what it is. So from us being naive about the business, it created a dynamic that's turned into a fever, which is basically what streaming is doing for the artists today. It's creating a fever, but because everyone can stream and everyone can be on the platform, it's less unique. It's not as unique as someone taking a video and saying, we already released the soundtrack on a skate video, but we're going to repackage it because the footage that we have now is going to take it so far over the top that no one's ever seen any skate footage like this applied to this music. And that, to me, Stacey, as far as that made me solidify why McRad still has legs, because Stacey was able to take our lifestyle and passion, him writing me writing him at age 14, and being able to tell a story without saying anything about, I've known this guy since he's been a teenager. He was just like, he's proven himself as a musician. He's proven himself as a skater. I should test this market out and see if a skater playing music can relate to skate footage, and it bang. And there's other stories of what McRad is all about, but that to me is the proof of like, wow, I can sit in my living room, work on a riff, think about skating, attach it to my youth of writing Stacey, not even know that it's going to meet up in the ethers of kind of like the attachment universe. And all of a sudden it works in a video. And then 30 something years later, people are still saying, wow, like what McRad is Weakness and McShred, along with everything else, Prevent That Tragedy, whatever. But the staples are what Stacey created. you know, and that's important for anyone. If you have a higher mentor that is a visual artist and you can apply that to your music before you even create an identity or even a fan base, it's always a better fit because the visuals are going to last forever, even if they don't get picked up on for 20, 30 years. Because what Stacey was bringing out was what was missed out of the Z Boys. Like, because it's, you know, he said in the Z Boys documentary that, you know, after the first contest, that, you know, everyone just kind of, the team imploded, you know, because everyone, the egos got there. There was no common force of like, we're all into this. You know, they had, it was too close to what rock and roll and what the surf mentality was about, which is like, it's all about me. You know, like Stacey helped us gather. To me, McRad was a gatherer of a bunch of different like kind of modes and lifestyles to just say, you know what, the reason why I was unique is because we're young kids and we're in the skateboarding thing. And for some reason we wanted to stick to it. And then I had to take it and take the original band and make something new with it, a new McRad, like when I wrote Weakness, you know what I mean? Because our first record was more about us as kids. And then once the band had broken up and we had to deal with regular life situations, people not being able to be around because they had to go to college or whatever, or their lives had to change. My adult aspect was like, I was the adult in the band. And if McRad was my baby, regardless of what I was doing, I had to make sure that the baby was fed. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't want to give up on why the first punk shows for me were so important in Philadelphia. It's because we had a band and our title was a part of us. And Stacey took that and made it so unique. Even before I recorded Weakness and before public domain, the fact that I wrote him and I remember writing him and saying, Stacey, I'm about to start a band and I feel really happy. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, I'm happy that I had somebody to share my band with. That was unique.
Pretty freaking amazing.
With him. I respected him as a skater. I mean, Stacey as a skater back in the day was so amazing.
His style is so smooth.
Yeah. He's a gem of a person, and he's an actor. You know, he brought so much. He was a reason why we could get away with a thing called skate TV, and he bridged the gap of skateboarding going into Nickelodeon. So many different things that people were not doing, and he never held on to it like it was his idea. It was always like, I'm going to do this because I have the people and the cast around me. You know what I mean? It's so important. So there's other things about McRad and why it is important, but Stacey is the catalyst of why I was stoked to see that he did Devo's Freedom of Choice, and the fact that it goes from Devo's Freedom of Choice to, you know, the first POW video to, you know, basically Animal Chin. And then after Animal Chin, he's like, okay, identity crisis change. We have to be a lifestyle brand. This is like, and we have it. Why? Because they did their history and I've done my homework history, and I'm just merging two globs of like emotional clay. Because he could have went for the circle jerks. He could have went for, he knew all those guys. I mean, he could have went for any of those guys. You know what I mean? He didn't have to take some underground band. For some reason, he knew that I don't want to strip the lifestyle from skateboarding this time. Why don't I just keep it in? Why don't I just let it push everybody to the forefront? Don't sell out my original ideal because I'm Stacey Peralta and I have access to all these people. Because he was just as big as a Tony Alva back in the day, in a different light. I mean, everyone knew Stacey. I mean, he had the insides of LA more than anyone else. You know, that's what I've found out and what I've learned moving to California and learning LA from him. He's the reason why I know how to handle myself in LA. You know, he's the main culprit.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really heavy.
Yeah, and of course, you know, at that time, you know, Powell Peralta was probably the biggest skate brand in the world.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was it was scary.
The biggest skaters in the world. So I mean, you know, the fact that they chose, you know, McRad, I think, you know, says a lot about what you were doing and
I'm glad that you. Yeah, I'm glad that the bigness had a lifestyle, and Stacey actually took. I know I'm kind of looking off in the distance. So I just wanted to relate how it feels to me, because it's like it wasn't like we're looking at cameras and we're looking at each other trying to reconfigure what was so in the ethos of like, well, hopefully one day my band will get accepted and maybe we'll record something that somebody likes and maybe this will do whatever. Like today you could just go on Instagram and download somebody's clip, because most rad skaters, they don't want to get their clips taken down because they can't use music they're used to listening to all the time. So people just put up stuff with no music. So if you like a skater and you feel like you have eclectic music, now today you can just download it on your phone, attach your music to it, and put it back up. Back in the day, you had to spend months recording your record, let it sit there, let somebody come up with a great idea, and then let them see if maybe possibly one of your songs could make it in something or not. You know what I mean? And it's just the process of waiting made it so much more unique, and it's like memory to me, because it was like the process took longer. Now it's like,
that's true. Yeah. And
you can almost overuse your presence online, because if your stuff is out there so much, a bigger company may not want to mess with it because of how much it's been spread out already.
True. It's not as unique anymore.
Yeah. So you have to kind of stagger your music and your releases, because there may be a guru that's just sitting back and watching how you develop yourself over 5 to 6 months or a year's time, versus most people back in the day didn't have that. If they got something that it was just a random hot pick, you know what I mean? They'd be like, let's put it in now. Most people are like, you're visually have to be accepted amongst people hearing you. Back in the day, you were just heard and accepted. The visual thing didn't come to unless, okay, we put you on our thing, come play our video premiere. And then they didn't see it until then. And certain times it worked out, and certain times it didn't work out, depending on how violent the band was or what it was. And that's either in hip hop, punk rock, metal, whatever. Now you can look in and see, okay, we like the band, but maybe we shouldn't have this band play our video premiere, because it could be something that it's not conducive to us having a safe show. You know what I mean? It's like
right.
A lot of the things we didn't know was happening, and some of our great ideas turned into learning lessons, valuable learning lessons, to where some of the memories were good and some of the memories were not so good. What I do appreciate about having a history within punk rock was the darkness that I received, and what I learned makes this visual process so much easier to deal with, because you can actually map your day out and really get down and focus your audience, and you can critique yourself with how you are presenting yourself online today. You don't have to wait as long as we waited to be accepted, or to even realize if your music even works within a video clip. You know what I'm saying? It's just because it's like people are just trying to keep up with just staying current, because it's a 3-second mentality. If it doesn't grab you in 3 seconds, we couldn't exist. The cassette tape would not exist in the 3-second world.
No.
Just putting it in takes about 3 seconds.
Right.
So it's like it's this platform that we have now. It gives light to the past. You know what I mean? Because it's not everybody's attached to the lyrical side of it. Some people need to be the audiobook side of it, of punk rock and skateboarding, and what you guys are doing. This stuff is gonna be around for the next 100+ years. I mean, the archives and how these archives are gonna mean to people once they get past the genres of what's accepted. What's really gonna resonate with people is just like, wow, I can stack the last 20 years of all my favorite stuff, all my favorite interviews, I could just block out all the things that don't mean anything to me and get right down to what means to me. You know what I mean? I can hear Lemmy say something, and I can also hear Ian MacKaye say something, and I can hear Jimi Hendrix say something. You know what I mean? Or Bob Dylan, or you can go and listen to Django Reinhardt, and you can go listen to Greg Hedson play. You don't have to be stuck anywhere now. But the fact of the matter is, this format needs our history and your history and her history, whatever, to bring all this stuff forward. You know what I mean? It has to come forward, because a lot of things, if you watch the documentary Standing in the Shadows of Motown, it will give you a really horrible insight of like a studio musician sitting in there with the guy, Alan Slutsky, and the guy's going, "This is you on guitar." And the guy's like, "Yeah, so what? We were just the studio guys." It was like, this song was bigger than what you guys did, was bigger than the Beatles. It's like, well, yeah, but when the business moved, they just took our jobs and we were out of jobs. And that was it. It was over. There was no footage. There's no back reels. There's no, you know what I mean? It took Standing in the Shadows of Motown to come out, and probably 30% of the people had passed. And about time it come out, and they started doing the tours, the guys that they only could do one tour because everyone in the band was too old to do any more. You know what I mean? Like a friend of mine was on that tour with them and in the documentary, and he was just telling me how much of a wild experience it was watching these grown men go through some of the most groundbreaking records of their lives. And they were just like, you know what? We were just getting high, doing our thing. We all were jazz musicians. We'd all play till 6 in the morning, and then we wake up the next morning and go right back to work, hammer out session work. And some of the stuff that we thought was crap ended up being hits. And some of the stuff we thought were hits didn't do anything. But the fact of the matter was, it's like that original cast and crew of people who created all this music that we create from, a lot of young people will probably never know those people because of social media. I mean, and the fact that they didn't have it. These shows are going to give people the insight to take the train ride back without it being a long, tedious process, you know.
And that's what I love is just, you know, hearing stories like, you know, of what your scenes and, you know, back in Philly and then, you know, in Wilmington and then going to Cherry Hill.
Yeah, that's weird.
It's so cool, you know, because we did an interview with Mark Abrook from Zorlak, and you know, he's originally from England, but he moved to the States, you know, in the early '80s, and Cherry Hill was one of his home parks for several years.
Yeah.
So you know, it's just cool hearing, you know, all these different connections, you know, from, you know, this time period, and you know, I love, you know, hearing these stories and getting to share them with a wider audience, hopefully, and you know, keeping this alive for the, you know,
and the funny thing you mentioned Mark, because I met Mark and his friends the first time that they arrived in Cherry Hill.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, we because I've been to Texas a couple of times, and most of the time I'm there, I see Mark, and it's funny, like,
oh, that's awesome.
I know when I was a kid, because they had just showed up and they were these dudes from England. I was like, what? You know what I mean? I was on them because they were the type of guys, not to get off a point where you were, like Mark and his friends, like guys in England were way more loose than guys like in America. And to say the least, basically, I've come to that is just that one of Mark's friends were in the pro shop and he was all sweaty, and it was after a session, and he decided he wanted to change his clothes. So it wasn't Mark, it was a friend of Mark's. And so I was standing there about to, you know, start skating, and I put my pads on. And so instead of this guy going into the bathroom, he just drops his shorts with his boxers right there in front of everybody and literally just starts changing right in front of us. And I remember all my friends being like, wow, these dudes from England don't really care. Like, it's just nothing to them. They're just like, they're not even hard on themselves. They're just raw. The guy was like, I'm sweaty. I'm changing right here. I'm not going to be polite. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It makes sense that Mark moved to the States because him and his friends were so integrated already that when I saw him in Texas, I was just like, wow, you took this. Once again, he had to, like me moving from Delaware to Philly, he realized I have to get, if I want the skateboard experience and the lifestyle, I have to move. And he just happened to move to Texas, which is the most epic place to get all of that when he was there. You know what I mean?
Oh,
so
yeah. That's
pretty funny.
Oh man, that's great. Well, and that's.
I know I'm long-winded. I'm sorry that I'm long-winded. Yeah, I mean, I could definitely be more focused too. If you have like points and references or you want me to talk about, it's just that I'm literally coming back into just feeling rested after my event on Saturday. So sorry for the drawn out.
No, this has been fantastic.
And I'll have my son is here, but if you want to get his, because I'm also one that's starting to integrate him in some of the interviews, but maybe having his version of what punk rock is in like a couple of sentences to have him to speak his mind, because he is the youngest version of what I'm talking about. And I'm starting to, since he's 18 now, and I remember being 18, and we're actually living in Ambler, PA, where McRad recorded their first record. Our first Dominant Force was probably recorded 3 or 4 blocks from where I'm living right now. And I still haven't gone to the building to see it, but the building's still there. So it feels good to be here with him creating music where I created our first real record. You know what I mean?
That's so awesome, man.
It's a trip.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time here.
Sure.
And I will. Oh, yeah, this is gonna be awesome, there, man.
You, man.
Bye.
Bye-bye.